I was never a person who believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. I always thought those ghost stories were nonsense, something made up to scare children or sell horror books. So, when I was offered the night shift on Route 303, I didn't think twice before accepting. I needed the money, and it seemed like an easy job, or at least, that's what I thought. Route 303 had a peculiar reputation. Veteran drivers would whisper about strange events, disappearing passengers, and other stories that sounded like urban legends. Many refused to work this route, especially at night. Ghost stories, I thought, laughing inside. There have always been rational explanations for everything, and I was determined to prove that this case was no different. My first shift began on a particularly cold and dark night. The kind of night where the streetlights seem dimmer and the silence of the early hours is almost deafening. I picked up the bus at the empty terminal, and while adjusting the seat and mirrors, I couldn't help but notice the state of the vehicle. It was an old model, with worn seats and scratched windows. There was a feeling that this bus carried decades of untold stories and forgotten passengers. As soon as I started the bus, the feeling of unease intensified. There was nothing specific, just a shiver down my spine. Probably just first-day nerves, I thought, trying to calm myself. As I drove through the nearly deserted streets, I glanced at the dashboard clock, 11:45 p.m. The night shift officially started at midnight, and I had plenty of time to familiarize myself with the route. As the bus moved through the city, I began to recall the stories I had heard about Route 303. They spoke of a terrible accident that occurred decades ago, when a bus full of passengers fell off a bridge. Everyone died, and since then, some drivers claimed to see strange people getting on the bus, only to disappear before the last stop. Pure nonsense, I murmured to myself, trying to dispel the growing discomfort. Finally, midnight arrived, and my first passenger boarded. It was an elderly man, with worn-out clothes and a distant look. He didn't say a word, just paid the fare and sat at the back of the bus. I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed he was staring out the window, although there was nothing to see but the darkness of the night. Something about that man bothered me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As the night wore on, other passengers got on and off, each more peculiar than the last. There was a young woman with a constant expression of panic, a man in a suit who seemed to be covered in dust, and a child who sat alone, with no adult around. It was a collection of strange figures, but I tried not to let it get to me. It's just a coincidence, I kept telling myself. However, as the night progressed and the number of passengers dwindled, the feeling of unease grew. The silence on the bus was heavy, only broken by the occasional sound of tires on asphalt and the static of the radio. The passengers seemed not to interact with each other, each lost in their own dark thoughts. I was beginning to wonder if there was something more to Route 303 than I was willing to believe. Then, something strange happened. At the end of my shift, as I was preparing to return to the terminal, I looked in the rearview mirror and noticed that the elderly man was still sitting at the back of the bus, staring out. "Last stop," I announced, expecting him to get up. But he didn't move. I sighed and walked back to him, but when I got there, the seat was empty. I looked around, confused. He couldn't have gotten off without me noticing. I looked under the seats, front and back, but there was no sign of the man. He had simply vanished. The chill down my spine returned, this time more intense. Maybe there was some truth to the stories I had always dismissed. I closed the bus and decided that, on the next shift, I would be more attentive. After all, one thing was certain, that was not going to be an ordinary night. After that first strange night, I returned home with an uncomfortable feeling that something was wrong. I slept poorly, with disturbing dreams of empty faces and blank stares. But, as always, I forced myself to be rational. It was just my imagination, I repeated to myself. However, the image of the elderly man who disappeared wouldn't leave my mind. On the second shift, I resumed Route 303 with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. At the first stop, a young woman got on. She wore a vintage dress, as if she had stepped straight out of the 1950s, and had a glassy look in her eyes, as if she were seeing something that no one else could. "Good evening," I said to her, but got no response. She just walked to the middle of the bus and sat down, clutching a worn handbag. The following passengers were no less strange. A burly man with a thick mustache and a felt hat boarded and sat down without saying a word. He looked like a character from an old movie, with a stern and distant expression. Then, an elderly couple boarded, carrying a large leather suitcase. The woman, with her hair styled in perfect waves, wore heavy makeup, while the man wore a suit that seemed more suited for a funeral than a nighttime bus ride. As I drove, I started to notice something was off. Most of these passengers had an out-of-time air about them, as if they were from decades past. Moreover, no one spoke, not to each other or to me. There was a strange sense of isolation and desolation inside the bus. The silence was heavy, broken only by the engine's hum and the muffled sounds of the city outside. What really started to disturb me was how some of these passengers got off the bus. At a stop in the middle of nowhere, the burly man suddenly stood up and rang the bell. When I stopped, he got off without looking back. I looked in the rearview mirror, but the place where he got off had nothing but a deserted road surrounded by dark trees. No houses, no cars, nothing. He simply walked into the darkness, and within seconds, disappeared from sight. On another occasion, the young woman in the vintage dress got off at a stop where there was absolutely nothing. No shops, no houses, not even a side street. She got off, walked a few steps, and then vanished into the darkness. I watched, waiting to see her reappear, but there was no sign of her. The height of the strangeness came when the elderly couple asked to get off at a nameless location. It was an abandoned area, with old buildings and broken windows. They got off together, dragging the leather suitcase with visible effort. I watched, confused, as they walked away. The bus was completely empty after that, and a sinister silence filled the air. As the night wore on, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. I constantly looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see familiar faces, but the bus seemed emptier than ever. At one point, I stopped the bus and made a quick round to see if anyone was hiding, but found nothing. I stood there for a moment in the silent corridor, and a feeling of dread washed over me. I was alone, but at the same time, I felt like I was being watched. When I finally finished my shift and returned to the terminal, I was exhausted, but mostly confused. Who were these people? Why did they get off in such strange places? And more importantly, how did they simply disappear? I was starting to realize that Route 303 carried much more than just passengers. It carried stories, secrets, and perhaps even lost souls. And I, who had always been a skeptic, was being confronted with something I couldn't explain. The days passed slowly, but the nights on Route 303 were getting stranger and stranger. I was starting to get used to the eccentric passengers and inexplicable stops, but then things got even more disturbing. On one of those nights, shortly after the shift began, I noticed that the objects inside the bus seemed to have a will of their own. First, it was the mirrors, which adjusted themselves while I was driving. I thought it was just the road bump, but when the small rearview mirror hanging on the dashboard abruptly turned to the side, I felt a chill. It was well secured, and there was no reason for it to move that way. In the following nights, the strange events continued. On one occasion, The digital sign indicating the bus's destination started flashing and changing messages, displaying words like help and exit, even though I hadn't touched anything. I stopped the bus and tried to fix the error, but as soon as I sat down, everything returned to normal. I stayed still for a few moments, trying to catch my breath and control my nerves. What disturbed me the most were the voices. I started hearing whispers when I was alone on the bus, especially at times when there were no passengers. At first, I thought I was hearing things, or maybe it was just the sound of the wind coming through the cracks. But the voices were distinct, though I couldn't understand what they were saying. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me, murmuring incoherent words. When I tried to locate the source of the whispers, they stopped, leaving an even more oppressive silence. Then, the most terrifying night of all happened. It was a cold, damp early morning, and the air inside the bus felt thicker than usual. I was at the end of the route, thinking I might have a relatively quiet night, when a man boarded. He was tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a hat that partially covered his face. But it was the feeling he brought with him that froze me. There was something inherently wrong with him. I couldn't clearly see his eyes, but I could feel his gaze fixed on me, as if he were studying me. The man didn't say a word, just walked slowly to the back of the bus and sat down, always looking in my direction. His movements were strangely fluid, almost as if he were gliding across the floor. An intense cold filled the bus, and I had to fight the urge to keep looking back constantly. Every time I glanced in the mirror, he was there, motionless, watching me. His presence was suffocating, almost as if he were draining the air from the environment. I tried to focus on the road, but my eyes were constantly drawn to the mirror. The silence was broken only by the sound of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustling of clothes, but I didn't know if it was him moving or just my imagination. At some point, I started hearing a rhythmic sound, like a soft tapping. I realized it was the man, lightly tapping his fingers on the seat beside him, in an almost hypnotic way. My heart raced. Something was deeply wrong, and I knew I needed to get out of that situation. When we finally reached the last stop, the man didn't move. I stood still for a moment, waiting for him to get off, but he remained seated, watching me. "Last stop," I announced, trying to sound firm. He just tilted his head slightly, and for a brief second, I thought I saw a cruel smile on his lips. I decided I had to do something. I got up, intending to confront him or at least understand what was happening. But when I turned to face him, the seat was empty. The coat and hat were still there, as if he had dissolved into the air. I was paralyzed, feeling a wave of terror wash over me. The silence inside the bus seemed to scream, and the lights flickered for a brief moment. I grabbed the coat and hat, but there was no sign of the man. I was alone, or at least it seemed that way. I quickly left the bus, and in the cold of the night, I felt a presence behind me. When I turned, there was nothing. The cold and fear were almost unbearable. Something on that route was deeply wrong, something that defied logic and reason. And I, who never believed in ghosts or the supernatural, was now convinced that there were forces beyond human understanding at work on that bus. My final night on Route 303 arrived with a sense of dark inevitability. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The events of the previous nights were still fresh in my mind, and I was determined to complete my last shift and never look back. As I took over the bus, the air was heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I didn't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if there was truly something sinister about the vehicle. The dashboard lights flickered intermittently, and the engine emitted a low, almost groaning buzz. I felt like a prisoner heading to his execution, but I knew I had to face that night to find some peace. As the night progressed, passengers began to board. They all had that strange air, as if they didn't belong to our time. There was a stern-looking man with a wide-brimmed hat and a woman in a long, dark dress, with eyes that seemed empty of life. Each of them looked like a shadow from a bygone era, and I noticed they all had something in common, a look of deep sadness, as if they were trapped in some form of eternal suffering. Then, he boarded again, the man in the long coat and hat. His presence was overwhelming, as if he were sucking all the light and warmth from the environment. He moved to the back of the bus with the same unsettling fluidity as before, and once again, his eyes seemed to pierce my soul. I couldn't look away, even as I felt panic building in my chest. That's when everything started to go wrong. The bus lights began to flicker violently, casting shadows that danced on the walls like living entities. The engine roared like a wounded animal, and the bus jolted, nearly throwing me from the seat. I struggled to maintain control, but it was as if the vehicle had a life of its own. The sinister passenger in the back remained still, only watching me with that enigmatic smile I was beginning to hate. The lights kept flickering, and for a moment, everything went dark. When the lights came back, the passengers looked different. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty, and their clothes covered in dust. The man with the hat and the woman in the long dress were standing in the aisle, their faces now in a state of ghostly disintegration. I felt a wave of horror and despair engulf me. These were not just strange people, but something much worse. At the height of the chaos, the bus began to slow down on its own, and the doors opened. The ghostly passenger rose and began walking towards me, while the rest of the passengers stood still, watching. Fear overtook me, and for a moment, I thought about simply running off the bus. But something kept me in place, a mix of fascination and terror. He stopped in front of me, and for a moment, our eyes met. His face began to transform, human features dissolving into a pale, translucent mask. That's when it all made sense. These passengers were not alive. They were spirits, remnants of a terrible accident that had happened many years ago. Route 303 had witnessed a tragedy where everyone on board had died, and now their souls were trapped, eternally repeating that journey. The ghostly passenger, now revealed in all his macabre glory, smiled coldly and cruelly. "You see us now," he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. "But that's not enough. You must understand what happened here." Suddenly, a flood of images invaded my mind, the bus falling from a bridge, the passengers' screams, the fire, the darkness. I was reliving the disaster that had trapped them there. The bus finally stopped, and the vision dissipated. I was gasping, sweating cold, and my heart raced. The ghosts began to disappear, one by one, dissolving into the air. The last thing I saw was the mysterious passenger, still smiling, before vanishing completely. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. I stumbled off the bus, feeling as if I had aged years in just one night. I looked back one last time and saw only an ordinary, empty bus. But I knew that behind that mundane appearance, there was a story of pain and suffering that would continue to haunt Route 303 forever. After that final night, I knew I couldn't continue. The experience left me shaken in a way I never thought possible. The next morning, with the first rays of sunlight streaming through my apartment window, I did the only thing I could. I called my supervisor and resigned. I gave a simplified story about personal reasons and the need to change my surroundings. He accepted without much question, perhaps accustomed to hearing excuses from drivers unwilling to work the more challenging night shifts. I hung up the call and sat down, feeling an incredible weight lift from my shoulders. But the relief was short-lived. I began to think about Route 303 and the ghostly passengers who would never leave my mind. The pale faces, the empty eyes, the incomprehensible whispers. It all felt like a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't. That bus was laden with something dark, something that defied logic and reason. In the days that followed, I tried to mentally distance myself from it all. But at every corner, every passing bus, I saw shadows of those passengers. Sometimes, during the night, I would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling as if I was being watched. It was as if something from that world had clung to me, keeping me bound to it. I told the story to a few people, close friends, trying to find some validation for what I experienced. Their reactions ranged from polite skepticism to evident discomfort. Some suggested I was just exhausted or that I let my imagination run wild. Others, more superstitious, said I might have actually seen ghosts. But in the end, it didn't matter what they believed. I knew what I saw and felt, and that was enough to keep me away from that bus forever. One day, out of morbid curiosity, I passed by the terminal where Route 303 began its route. There it was, standing as always, with passengers coming and going, as if it were just another ordinary day. No one seemed to notice or care about what I knew was there. The route continued to operate, indifferent to the secrets it carried. I wondered how many more would go through what I did or if they simply didn't see what I saw. Sometimes, I still question whether it was all real. Maybe my mind played tricks on me, mixing horror stories with my own exhaustion. But even so, I can't deny the palpable sense of fear and supernatural presence I felt. Whether they were real ghosts or just projections of my mind, what I experienced on that route changed me forever. Now, whenever I see a bus passing by, especially at night, I wonder about the secrets it might carry. I learned the hard way that some things are best left untouched. And even if I never get definitive answers about what happened, I know one thing: I'll never set foot on Route 303 again.